Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Bewildered 10 Humanoid Encounters. I gave this episode that title because it's a common reaction to a humanoid encounter. An encounter with a humanoid challenges a person on multiple levels, sometimes physically, but almost always emotionally, mentally, spiritually, psychically. It causes profound changes in a person, completely changes their worldview, changes how they look at themselves and the universe that we live in. So, these cases certainly show this. I've chosen, of course, 10 cases from all over the world, spanning 40 years, from the 1970s to the 2000s. And the cases today come from the United States, also South America, including Chile and Argentina, but all over the world. I've got a case from Cuba, one from Greece, another from Italy, Spain, France, and Norway. So quite a number of different locations, and of course, different kinds of humanoids. These cases are so interesting. And I think each of these cases does have something to teach us, not only about the universe we live in, but about ourselves. These cases are some multiple witness, some are single witness. A good number of them do have some pretty compelling evidence in the form of physiological effects, or perhaps animal reactions, landing traces, and so forth. But it's going to be a pretty long episode, so let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about today, I call Black Hole Aliens. And you'll see why I gave it that title in just a second. This one took place on August 26, 1974 in Feignies, France. And it's a really remarkable case. The investigators to this case kind of looked at this one as an example of how truly high strangeness is a part of the UFO experience and how ETs apparently put on a display sometimes. So this one, yeah, it's quite unusual. It is a multiple witness case, and I hope you find it as interesting as I did. This case comes from Marie Bigorne and was published in the French publication Lumière dans la nuit, Lights in the Night. It begins when the witness's daughter, Cécile Moret, normally very punctual, well, she failed to return home at her curfew of 8:30 p.m. on August 26, 1974, after going to a party in the town of Feignies. This is in France. Now, her father, Gerard, stepped outside to take a look around, see if she was coming home. Did not see her. It was now just before 9 p.m. But looking up, he noticed something quite odd in the sky. A perfectly round black hole, a circle in the sky, which stood out starkly against the gray background. Now this circle seemed to glow slightly around the edges, sort of a white aura. And looking at it, he said it looked pretty close. Maybe about 600 to 700 feet away, he estimates. But when he first saw it, this was stationary in the sky, perfectly still. But as he watched, it now seemed to be descending slowly. And seeing how strange and unusual this was, he rushed back inside, got his wife, and together they went back outside and watched as this black circular object descended until after almost 10 minutes was only 60 or 70 feet above the ground. At this point they estimated it was about 25 feet in diameter. And it was then that this object did something amazing. It split in half vertically, forming two semicircles. The right semicircle began to either decrease in size or move away. They couldn't quite tell, but it did this slowly and finally disappeared. Meanwhile, the one on the left remained, but it also did something peculiar. A line or a veil of some kind of like a curtain, they said, went across its surface from left to right, and this revealed two figures standing next to each other inside this semicircle. According to the witnesses, they looked kind of like astronauts, complete with white, full-body metallic spacesuits and helmets. Sort of white-gray, they said. They could clearly see their arms and legs, And as they watched, these two figures began to move around. And they moved strangely, almost more like puppets, they said, than living beings. In fact, these two figures looked almost two-dimensional. Just were not walking normally. They sort of blundered and waddled around inside this semicircle, moving almost mechanically from one side to the other. And they looked quite short, about 4.5 feet tall. So Gerard and his wife were absolutely stunned by this sight, and they watched it, almost entranced, for a full 40 minutes. They said that during this time the object made no noise, and in fact an unnatural silence settled over the entire environment. Also strange, they noticed that no other cars passed by. Suddenly snapping out of their trance and seeing that it was now 10 p.m., Gerard decided to go fetch his daughter. He left by bicycle to find his daughter Cecile, and his wife went back inside. This object was still there when they both stopped looking at it. When Gerard returned home with his daughter, neither of them bothered to look up into the sky to see if this object was still there, which is also strange. And researcher Marie Bigorne, who looked into this, he interviewed the witnesses. He said that the witnesses were, quote, completely without any interest in the UFO phenomenon. He called the encounter, quote, a high strangeness display. And this exemplified how difficult it is to explain UFO activity. So definitely some high strangeness there. It's really interesting to me that at some point they just stopped looking, weren't interested in what was going on any longer. We do see this sometimes. Perhaps it's just mental overload. I don't know, but certainly a fascinating case. And here's another. I wanted to include this one because it's such a common pattern we see with these landings and humanoids, where a craft comes down, ETs come out, they walk right up to a witness, give a very short message, and then off they go on their merry way. I called this one Aliens in the Andes. This took place on February 17, 1981 in Manzano Amargo in the Cordillera, the foothills of the Andes. This is in Argentina. And it's a truly fascinating multiple witness case. Some really fascinating aspects to it. And I think you'll find it definitely an unusual case. This case comes from researcher Carlos Daniel Ferguson. The main witness is Jose Fermin Albornoz. He's a 49-year-old cattleman, married with 7 children. Unable to read or write, Jose has spent pretty much his entire life in this remote area of Manzano Amargo. This is located at about 12,000 feet altitude in the Cordillera of the Argentinian Andes. It was on the night of February 17, 1981 that Jose rode by horseback up to La Veraneada. This is a step in the mountains where he and his 2 co-workers look after a pen of fenced-in sheep. It was around 4 a.m. that Jose woke up when the sheep and the horses and the dogs and all the animals in the area began acting up. And sitting up and looking around, Jose was shocked to see a glowing blue circular object about 10 feet wide, hovering just a few feet above the ground, only 65 feet away. It was close enough that Jose could actually feel heat coming from it. And as Jose says, the light was a lovely light, bluish, clear, a beautiful light. I don't know what it was because I don't study. I don't know how to read, so I don't know what these things might be. But he knew it was strange, so he immediately woke up one of his companions. But his companion, seeing the craft, immediately shrieked with fear and hid under his blankets. Jose at this point could hear a loud buzzing sound, and it seemed as if the ground itself almost vibrated. And this is when, without warning, 2 humanoid figures suddenly appeared before him. And as Jose says, I don't know where they came from. They just did it. They appeared. These were not normal people. They were about 3 to 3.5 feet tall, with disproportionately large heads, stout bodies. They both wore dark blue, tight-fitting, full-body jumpsuits. No buttons, no zippers, no markings of any kind. He couldn't see any facial features, but he did say that, quote, they had something on their heads like a sort of helmet. So as he watched, they stood motionless, only about 6 feet away from him, and they both began to speak in an incomprehensible language. As Jose says, I didn't understand what they told me, but they did speak to me. I couldn't look at their faces, but I wanted to. I was very frightened and shook all over. So at this point, Jose was filled with fear. In fact, he thought that he was about to die, and he told himself, Dear Lord, it's the end of the world, and I'm not with my family. And as Jose says, that's when I lost control and was out of courage. I wanted to run off to where the others were, but my heart was beating too fast. I was shaking from fear. I passed out from fear. So he fell to the ground and awoke just seconds later, in time enough to see, along with his companion, this weird glowing blue sphere move off to the west. Now his companion did not see the humanoids, but he was in such severe emotional shock from seeing this craft that he actually refused to speak about it to anyone. Of course, all the animals in the area did react to the presence of this craft and humanoids. Several of them ran off, which entailed a long search to find them the next day. An inspection of the site where this object hovered and the humanoids stood revealed no evidence. Now, investigators asked if the witness might have mistaken this object for a helicopter and its pilots, which Jose, of course, denied. He had heard of flying saucers. In fact, he had seen an unexplained light earlier while in the town of Chihuidos, but he didn't talk or think much about UFOs in general. When asked if his experience might have been a dream, he said, No, sir, I was completely awake. So there was an investigation done. The witness was interviewed thoroughly, and the investigators learned that all those who knew Jose vouched for his honesty and integrity. To me, the most interesting thing about that case is how the ETs behave, walking right up to this witness and then walking back into their UFO. I also like it because it's a really good witness. He's clearly sincere, very well respected. The location itself is also very interesting. I mean, there are a lot of things we can learn from each of these cases. And now we move to another one, which is remarkably similar, actually. I call this one Humanoids at the Campground. This took place in 1981 in Laguna Sofia, Chile, in a very remote location, in a campground, of course. Again, multiple witnesses in this case. Very close up encounter with a landed UFO and humanoids, and some really compelling aspects to it. It is quite brief, but I think it's an important case. The researcher in this case is Jose Antonio Caravaca. It's quite a brief case, but quite interesting. And it took place at a campground in Torres del Paine National Park at Laguna Sofia, Puerto Natales, Chile. It was one evening in 1981 that the witness, an anonymous woman, she was with several other people at this campground. They were all in their tents, retired for the evening, when the witness decided to step briefly out of her tent to take a look at the scenery. To her amazement, she saw this craft, a large craft about the size of a 2-story house. It was your typical saucer shape, had rounded white windows around the edge, and she watched it drop down from the sky and actually land on a small hill about 200 feet away. Immediately, a door opened and a ramp with steps extended down to the ground. Now she became curious, and she approached this object and was amazed to see 3 tall humanoid figures walking around it. She said they each wore what looked like diving suits with a mask, much like welders use, with a faceplate. And she did notice that a spiral, cable-like device was at the tip of each mask. These beings first walked around the craft as if inspecting it, and then they proceeded to take soil samples. This is what it looked like to her. She was close enough that she could actually see directly inside this craft. And this is the most interesting part, perhaps, of this case, because she was amazed to see lights, machinery with buttons on it, a few computer-like monitors which had weird symbols like X's and other symbols inscribed on them. Needless to say, she was quite shocked by this. She ran back to the campground, woke up the other campers. Everyone ran out of their tents in time to hear a loud noise and watch this object take off and move slowly away to the north. There were at least 10 witnesses to this event. So there you go, another case of a landing and a humanoid, humanoids. And so interesting because here's that pattern again where a craft comes down, humanoids come out, stay for just a little bit, and return into the craft and off they go. Not quite sure what they're up to, but it does appear in this case they were taking soil samples. So perhaps that was the motive here. Hard to say for sure. Don't like to speculate, but that's what it looks like. And now we move to another case, and this one is really compelling. This is a single witness case for the most part, but it does have landing traces, it's got physiological effects and animal reactions, and there are some corroborating witnesses as well to what the main witness saw. I call this one the light-headed alien. This is on October 9, 1984 in Polcanto, Italy, and it's a really bizarre and unusual case in a lot of ways. This next case was very thoroughly researched by researchers, journalists, military officers, but the main researcher is Pier Luigi Sani. It was about 3:30 a.m., again on October 9, 1984, when the witness, Isidoro Ferri, he was a doorman who worked at the Via La Radicchia, he was woken up by a bright light streaming onto his face from his bedroom window. He says as soon as this happened, there was an overpowering silence that filled the environment. This is that weird Oz effect we hear about so often. And looking out the window, he's still in bed, he saw that the light was coming from a figure standing about 120 to 130 feet away, standing on top of a hill next to the house. This is just on the other side of his street, Via Tassia. Now this light itself was coming from the being's head or face. And Isidoro wondered if this figure might be a thief, when suddenly it seemed to disappear into a weird foggy blur, and in its place he could now see a dark horizontal line with a cupola on top. There's some confusion about what exactly he saw, but he did see 3 flames pointing down to the ground. He now wondered if someone was trying to set fire to his hut where he stored hay, not far from here, but he immediately rejected this theory when he saw that these flames were not normal. They looked like pinkish, quote, cones of light. One was going straight down from this object, and the other 2 were flaring off slightly to either side. So he stared at it, absolutely bewildered, trying to figure out what he was looking at, when it too disappeared. Wasn't over yet, because moments later, a brilliant, blindingly bright white light started to move towards his house, illuminating the entire area like daylight, including the interior of his room. At this point, Isidoro tried to approach the window, but as he did, he found himself paralyzed. He could feel the heat from this light hitting his face. He was able to turn his head slightly to protect his eyes, as this light seemed to sort of pulsate or flash at intervals. Now he wasn't sure if it was his own fear or the light itself which caused him to be unable to move, but at one point the light retracted, and now looking out he saw a vivid red sphere. It was completely smooth, and it began to flash painfully bright beams of light directly into Isidoro's eyes. And this light was strange, because although it was far too bright to even look at, it did not illuminate the area around it. So not a normal light. At this point the sphere rose upward, moved off at an angle, and disappeared behind a hill, and the encounter was essentially over. Now there were other family members in the house. His son was in the same room, but nobody woke up, nobody noticed anything. It was just Isidoro. And there were some strange after effects. He felt strangely calm, didn't talk about it, and went back to bed. Waking up the next morning, he was quite concerned about what happened. He reported it to the police, who showed up shortly later, along with UFO researchers and journalists. This case did draw a lot of interest, and there were some major after effects. For several days, Isidoro suffered from red and irritated eyes. He said he also felt disoriented and weak. There were some strange animal reactions as well. Their dog, who slept outside, did not bark during this encounter, but for the next 2 weeks his behavior changed dramatically. He refused all food and would stay inside his doghouse for 2 full weeks. He used to always bark at people who passed by. Not for these 2 weeks he didn't. And there was more evidence, because as the researchers converged on this area, they found 3 circular holes about 4 inches wide, 1 inch deep, in an irregular triangular formation on the ground. And it was clear that this was unusual because inside the marks, the pebbles inside them looked almost polished. And the grass in this area was also crushed to the ground. They did measure it for radiation, but found no evidence of radiation. But they did discover that there were many other witnesses in the area who had seen a red light in the sky at the time of Isidoro's encounter. So there you go. Physiological effects, animal reactions, landing traces. What more could you ask for? It's a really undeniable case of an ET visitation. As you can see, it did affect the witness profoundly. I have to give him kudos for stepping forward. I always wonder how many people have these kinds of experiences and tell nobody except perhaps their closest family members or friends, or perhaps not even them. I've certainly talked to witnesses personally who told me that they've told no one, not even their spouse. So again, the vast majority of cases go undocumented, and any estimates as to how common this is probably vastly underestimated. It's far more common than most people realize. And again, occurring all over the world, as this next case shows. I call this one the aliens at school. And I found this one really compelling because I have done a lot of research into UFO encounters over schoolyards. This is another one. It is a single witness case, but it did land next to a school. There are humanoids. And wow, this is a really unusual case, to say the least. This occurred in June of 1986 in Jørtorova, Norway. And I just found this a really poignant case, and I think you'll agree. This case took place in Ytterøya, Norway. The main witness is Leif. I believe that is a pseudonym, but it was a sunny day in June of 1986 as Leif finished delivering supplies to the Sam Verklejet store, which was located on the island of Ytterøya in Levanger, Norway. At this time, the store was located next to the sports field of a school on the south side of the island. Leif had just gotten some needed paperwork and was returning to his van, which was parked at the corner of a building. And this is when he walked into one of the strangest experiences of his life. As he says, "As I rounded the car, I met a small creature in a bright blue suit." Now he described it vividly. He said this being was very short, about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. It had tiny little hands and feet, a very thin body, a bald head, but it was really the eyes which most caught his attention because they were much larger than a human's eyes, almost completely black, and they were slanted up and around the side of its head. It wore a blue suit that was featureless and covered its body from the neck down. But most alarming of all to Leif was that the figure was now walking straight towards him. And it marched in a way that reminded Leif of a soldier, raising its knees and forearms while keeping its upper arms straight down against its body. And it covered the distance between them pretty quickly, approaching as close as 6 feet away. Needless to say, this really frightened Leif. He stepped back, ducked down, and hid slightly behind his van, and thoughts began to race through his mind, like who was this little man? Was he dangerous? Now no sooner had he thought this when this little man did a quick U-turn and began marching back the way he had come. Seeing this, Leaf straightened up and looked towards the man, and he could now see that this guy had returned to a small craft that was parked on the asphalt just behind the store, about 15 feet away from where Leaf stood, very close. So he got a good look at this craft, which he said was shaped like a half sphere, was flat on the bottom, it rested on 3 landing legs, was quite small, about 6 feet wide. He said it was solid gray on the bottom section, but had a transparent dome on top. And looking inside this transparent dome, he got a real shock, because he could clearly see 2 figures sitting side by side next to each other. Both looked identical, wore the same blue jumpsuit. And as he's looking at them, suddenly, both of them turned their heads together in perfect synchrony. These 2 little men then stared at him with an intense, piercing gaze, at which point the craft promptly took off in perfect silence. It flew at an angle up into the air, increasing speed for a few seconds, and then it darted off with an instant acceleration to the northeast, leaving nothing but a puff of condensation trailing it off into the distance. So Leaf was quite shook up. He went directly home. His wife could instantly see that something was wrong, and she wondered if perhaps her husband had gotten into some kind of accident. But he told her what happened, and seeing how upset he was, she knew he was telling the truth. Now, being afraid of ridicule and disbelief, Leaf shared his experience with only a few people. But 20 years later, still thinking about what happened, he no longer cared what people thought and decided that it was his duty to report his experience officially. Because he says that sometimes he still wakes up at night and can remember the intense, piercing eyes and the way these 2 beings turned their heads and stared at him just before this craft took off. So many cases like this one. There again, we have a UFO landing, ET's coming out, walking up to the witness, turning around, going back into the craft, and off they go. Just not sure what's going on here unless this is sort of an introduction, a way to let people know that ETs are real in a way that's absolutely undeniable. And it certainly was for the witness. His description of how he still thinks about this incident is very compelling. And I have to give him kudos again for stepping forward after quite some time, yes. But he did, and I'm glad he did, because otherwise we would never have heard about this. And I just know so many people are having these kinds of experiences. And now we move to another case, which is also really interesting. It's a multiple witness case, some really unusual humanoids. I call this one The Hunters and the Aliens. This took place on June 26, 1987 in Badajoz, Spain. It's a very close encounter. This typifies how people can react with extreme fear when they have one of these craft land nearby and humanoids come out and approach them. This next case is from researcher Iker Jimenez. There are 3 witnesses: Jacinto Tamaya, a construction worker, Alejo Gonzalez, a 34-year-old bar owner, and his 16-year-old employee Adolfo Jose de Villa. They were all friends, and it was at 2:30 a.m. on June 26, 1987, that they were hunting in a wilderness area of Puerto Moreno. This is near Higuera de la Serena in Badajoz, Spain. And their outing was pretty much uneventful until suddenly this very bright and unexplained light appeared in the sky. All 3 men turned in unison to observe what appeared to be a large luminous sphere. They thought for a split second it might be a star, but it was way too big. It was about the apparent size of a full moon, and it glowed this brilliant, clear, yellow-white light. So they began talking excitedly among themselves, speculating about the nature of this object, when suddenly, without warning, it zoomed towards them at high speed. They said it was, quote, much larger than that of a jet plane, meaning much faster. But it made a loud whistling sound as the object, in mere seconds, stopped above some nearby olive trees, and it was only about 12 feet above the ground, they estimate, and 75 feet away. so quite close. In fact, it illuminated the area around it like the sun at full noon, they said, including the hunters themselves. Now all three of them felt deep fear as this object remained stationary above the trees. They estimate it was quite large, 45, 50 feet in diameter. They could hear a loud whistling noise coming from this object, which was decreasing in volume but becoming more high-pitched. And this is when two very tall, heavy-set, and strong-looking figures appeared next to this object. They couldn't see them well, they were featureless, just two dark forms, but they said they looked almost like polished shadows with no features. And they were big. They estimate these figures were about 7.5 feet tall. And almost immediately, these two figures began to approach the witnesses, who of course became even more frightened. Now these two figures marched slowly at first, taking long strides, but then began to increase their speed, perhaps hovering above the ground, the witnesses thought. This caused Jacinto, Alejo, and Adolfo to panic. They turned and fled the scene without looking back, and they kept running at top speed until they came up to a river which blocked their way. Here they hid in the undergrowth, and looking back to where they had been, they could now see that this giant sphere of light was rising up, making the same loud whistling noise, and to their great relief it moved off into the distance. Now the men returned home, telling nobody at first what they had seen, because they were again afraid of being disbelieved or ridiculed. But they did share it with a few people, and news of their encounter spread quite quickly and was shortly later published in a local newspaper. This reached the ears of investigators, and researcher Pedro Maria Fernandez spoke directly with the witnesses, and following the directions of the hunters, he went to this area exactly where this object had hovered, and he found some evidence. He was amazed to see that the leaves on the trees showed evidence of exposure to high heat. They were all dried up and yellowed. It's hard to deny a case like that when you have three witnesses, landing traces as well. It's such a shame that they didn't just stand their ground and see what would happen, because it might have been a much more extensive encounter. Certainly not going to blame them for running. Who knows how we would react when we're in this situation. And now we move to the next case, which is probably my favorite in this little compilation, and it's certainly the most extensive, and I think the strangest and the most interesting. I mean, there's a lot to learn from this case. I call this one Katie and the Greys. It's a very extensive series of events, two main encounters. It took place in May of 1992 in Lime Grove. This is in Miami-Dade, Florida. And I'm so glad the witness came forward. She actually wrote a book about her encounters, as we'll see. But this is a case everyone should know about. The main witness in this case is Katie Frankovich. She's the daughter of a Navy commander. This case took place about 2 months before the devastating Hurricane Andrew. Now, Katie's case did receive quite a bit of publicity and attention. It certainly caught the attention of many prominent researchers, such as Daryl Sims, Linda Moulton Howe, Bud Hopkins, John Mack, and others. Katie, at the time of her encounter, lived in an apartment that overlooked 10 acres of semi-wilderness known as Lime Grove. This is in Miami-Dade, Florida. Now, living in this apartment, when she moved in, she was warned by her neighbors not to go into this area of Lime Grove, that strange things happened there. Nobody elaborated, and Katie didn't think too much of it. She had worked for a long time as a wildlife researcher. She didn't have any worries about being out in the wilds. She also had 4 dogs who were trained as attack dogs, and she enjoyed taking them on walks through Lime Grove. Now, when she would do this, she did say that she sometimes had the feeling of being watched, but again didn't think too much of it. She felt safe there with her dogs, but it was late one afternoon in May of 1992 that she was walking 2 of her dogs, And this is when she heard a strange, kind of a chopping sound, she said. And looking around, she saw something amazing. And I'll just quote Katie directly. As she says, exactly 3 rows over, approximately 30 feet from where I stood, was the strangest sight I had ever seen. Standing there quietly watching me was the oddest, the strangest, the most bizarre-looking being I had ever laid eyes on. So outrageously strange that at first glance, I honestly thought someone was standing there in a Halloween costume. I clearly recall thinking, is this some kind of joke? Then it hit me, really hit me hard. That was no costume, it was real. I absolutely froze, too shocked to move or even think about trying to. The dogs looked directly at it. Their reaction was unbelievable. Instead of lunging forward to aggressively ward it off, both dogs simultaneously laid down on the ground, putting their heads on their front paws and closing their eyes. 2 trained attack dogs, who would not hesitate to attack, laid down and appeared to be asleep. The entire situation was so bizarre that I could not believe what was happening. So what Katie was looking at was a figure, a gray E.T. She knew that whatever it was not human. She didn't think E.T. She had never really given any thought to UFOs or extraterrestrials. But as Katie says, it was the haunting eyes that took my breath away. Those big, black, almond-shaped eyes staring back at me. Not human, not animal. Solid black eyes without pupils, without eyelids, and not a trace of any white of the eye showing. So big in proportion to the rest of the strange face, they dominated it. Like the spine-chilling effect of a hooded cobra, they stared back, daunting, not blinking. The harder I tried to identify what I was looking at, the worse it got. The being's head was similar to a human's, but with obvious, striking differences. There wasn't any hair on the head or the rest of the body, and from the looks of it, never had been. The skin was a grayish color with a slight pinkish hue. The texture of it reminded me of the soft skin of a dolphin. The circumference of the head was much larger than that of a human. The overall structure was pear-shaped, coming down into a non-descriptive chin. The nose appeared too small in contrast, as if nothing more than 2 tiny nostrils. The mouth was about half the size of a human's. The arms were long and emaciated looking, with no visible muscle tone. But following the arms down to the hands, I was reminded of the orangutan ape only because this emaciated arm extended into a hand with long fingers. But unlike the ape, the thumb was located in the same place as the human hand. Now KT looked at this and she could see that this being did have 6 fingers on each hand. She said it had strong muscular looking legs, small feet. It appeared to be about 4 feet 9 inches tall. She had the distinct impression that this figure was male. She said it wore tight-fitting, metallic-looking clothes, kind of like spandex, with black boots that had no laces or buckles. She wondered how he got these shoes on because there was nothing on them. So they stood and watched each other for several moments until this figure moved partially behind a tree. At this point, Katie was afraid, but she was also curious and fascinated. And this is when movement on a nearby tree branch caught her eye, and she saw this strange, hairy, tribble-like creature sitting on a branch. Now she's very familiar with animals, and she went through various theories as to what this creature could be, but none fit. And as she's staring at it, it was covered with grayish-brown fur. She received a very clear, distinct telepathic message saying, "This is a possum." But she immediately rejected this explanation, did not believe it was a possum, and immediately a second message came, which said, "This is a raccoon." She did not believe that. She rejected that explanation. And then Katie surprised herself by reacting in a way that she never would have. This was totally out of character. She calmly walked away, as she said, quote, "as if nothing had ever happened." So she took about 15 steps away when she snapped out of what almost felt to her like a trance, and realizing what she had just seen, she immediately ran back to the site. She did notice at this point that everything was eerily quiet. Then she did hear a sound and suddenly saw this gray coming out from behind a tree, and it appeared to be clutching this bag to its chest. And looking at this bag, she could see this grayish creature inside it. And this is when the gray began running. She said it was like a gazelle, leaping 3 feet into the air with each step, moving at impossible speed, almost gliding through the air. This really amazed her, so she chased after him. And she was surprised to see that he didn't outrun her, because she said it looked like he could have easily, but instead he seemed to intentionally keep pace with her, off to the side. They both ran about 30 feet away from each other, side by side, for a good distance. She says about 5 small blocks. And this is when she heard this strange telepathic message over and over. Viente, viente, which she later learned meant, come, friend. This is in Castilian Spanish. So that's certainly interesting. And after running for several minutes, suddenly the being disappeared. This is when Katie noticed a terrible stench, which she said was somewhat like formaldehyde. She immediately sensed at this point that there were several other grays ahead of her. She's still in this grove of trees, by the way. So she decided to turn around and run. And her 2 dogs ran with her, right out of the grove, running up to Southwest 137th Avenue. And then she walked the quarter-mile back to her apartment. Now again, before this, Katie had never given any thought to aliens, but she called her friend and told her what happened. And this is when her friend said, this sounds like ETs. So that really floored her. And although this experience had been scary, Katie's curiosity was stronger than her fear, and she returned the next morning to investigate, but she could find no evidence, no footprints, nothing. But her experience wasn't over yet. She was about to have another one. It was just a few nights later, around 11:15 p.m. She was in her home, her dogs were asleep, and suddenly this strange green mist started to appear on the ceiling. And she watched it for a few moments when she decided to call a friend and speak to her. And she was on the phone with her, describing this mist as it formed, when she looked out the window, and lo and behold, there was the same type of gray ET that she had seen earlier, but it was now staring at her from outside. It was not the same one. It did look slightly different, she said, and she had the distinct impression that this one was female. And even more amazing was that directly behind it stood a smaller gray, who she sensed was male, and who she sensed was an adolescent. And I'll just let Katie describe this event, because she describes it well. As she says, I was amazed at how delicate, and in an unusual way, how startlingly beautiful she truly was. Her huge almond-shaped eyes were solid black, with no apparent eyelids or eyelashes. Once I adjusted to the strange physical features, I found the female to be quite precious. She was obviously inquisitive, yet at the same time a little timid. I could not help wondering what I looked like to her. Did she perceive me as intimidating? Or had she been able to adjust to my strange appearance quickly? I had to smile at the smaller one behind her with his peekaboo glances. He behaved just like a shy human youngster. To be in their presence and take this all in was one of the most breathtaking moments of my life. What could possibly be more extraordinary, more fascinating, than the incredible beings right before my very eyes? All I could think of was how wondrously gentle they were. It was very obvious from her body language and non-aggressive behavior. So she's watching this while she's on the phone with her friend, and she's describing this all to her friend. Her friend was more scared than Katie. And as she watched, this gray, this female gray, reached out and put her hand up against the screen of the window. Katie was amazed, not only at this, but at her own courage, because she stepped forward, reached out, and placed her hand against the window in the same way, in this sort of communication of greeting. And again, I'll just quote Katie directly. She says, "Our eyes remained fixed on each other, locked into position, exactly like our extended hands. Precisely then, I distinctly perceived a telepathic communication, every bit as clear as if the words had been audibly spoken. Protector of life. Protector of life." The gentle words echoed through my head, in my native language. She moved her head ever so slightly, and I heard the words again, "Protector of life." I instantly perceived that this was the designated name chosen for me. There have been few times in my life when I have experienced such tender feelings of compassion and gentleness emanated by another. Any lingering fears or doubts I may have had ceased to exist. From that point on, I perceived us as two individuals bonded by a mutual admiration and respect for one another. She was standing before me as the caretaker of the adolescent, her role identifiable as protector of life. As I watched, it suddenly occurred to me, I too was a caretaker for a male adolescent, my role as his mother identifiable as protector of life. It was that simple, yet that profound. "Thank you," I thought back humbly, "thank you." And with that, the younger being peeked out again, lingering there as he watched, the female removed her hand from the screen, and I slowly lowered mine. So it was at this point that the gray turned around, leaped off the porch, followed by the other gray, and they both moved off. And as Katie says, "It never ceases to intrigue me the way which this encounter was handled. The beings had chosen to approach me in a gentle, unobtrusive manner, indicating to me their intentions were not to instigate alarm or fright. The very presence of a female with an adolescent was something I, as a female, could readily identify with. This in itself put me at ease immediately. The behavior I witnessed that evening was definitely based upon a trusting, nurturing, and protective relationship. The same kind of bond we humans associate with love. The following day, I felt driven to do a drawing on a circular piece of wood and paint it. I am not the best painter in the world. However, when it was completed, I could not help but admire the unusual creation. The strange design resembled a three-point symbol of some sort. Although I had no way of proving what the symbol meant, I intuitively felt it symbolically represented the words "protector of life," a symbol that became so dear I would always keep it as an invaluable keepsake right outside my door. It remains there as the symbol of universal motherhood. I found this so interesting because Katie was a protector of wildlife as well. Lots of contactees have this incredible relationship with nature. They're environmentalists. And I think this might be part of the reason behind her contact. Now, it was just 2 days after this that she was confronted by two well-dressed men in black suits who flashed a badge at her, told her that they were from the federal government, and they wanted to know if she saw anything strange in the grove. Katie said nothing about her experience and said that she had seen people picking limes, but that's about it. She played dumb. The man persisted. Katie continued to play dumb. They kept asking her over and over if she had seen anything strange, which she denied. But she says they followed her for the next few weeks, keeping her under constant surveillance. Now, it was just a few weeks after this that Hurricane Andrew struck, destroyed her home, caused her grave injuries. But she did end up writing a book titled Where Heavens Meet, which is about her encounter and her struggles following Hurricane Andrew. I do think that's a very important case. It's really unusual. It shows how an encounter can be very frightening when in fact it's overall benevolent and friendly. I love how the ETs were basically telling her hello and welcome friend, giving her a message as well in her second encounter. And it's just a really beautiful series of events. And I'm so glad she came forward and talked about it. It's the kind of case I think that really shows how an encounter that's initially quite frightening reveals itself, in fact, to be quite benevolent overall. So a fascinating case on multiple levels. And now we move to another case, which I call Havana Humanoid. This one took place on November 27, 1995 in Havana, Cuba. Don't get a whole lot of cases from Cuba. I think that alone makes this case very interesting. Also interesting is that the main witness is a security guard. We have a lot of cases of night watchmen and security guards and policemen who see UFOs because obviously it's their job to be up outside late at night, and they get to see things that a lot of other people wouldn't necessarily see. And that's certainly true in this case of a landed UFO and humanoids. This amazing case was presented in the film OVNIs on Cuba. This is a documentary by Octavio Cortázar, Armando Linares, and Hugo Parado Francos. The witness is Samuel Rodolfo Barreras, who worked as a security guard at El Trigal. This is located right outside of Havana City in Cuba, and it was early on the morning of November 27, 1995, that Samuel was sitting at his post, which overlooks the courtyard of all the buildings that he's protecting, when he saw this bright light approaching. Now, seeing how low and bright it was, he first assumed that this was some kind of aircraft in trouble and in danger of crashing. But very quickly he watched this strange light approach, and his astonishment grew as he realized that this light was actually a classic flying saucer. And in fact, it came right up to his location, hovered directly over the roof of one of the buildings. So he was absolutely awestruck at this point. In fact, he now realized that he was completely paralyzed. He could not move, not a muscle, as this craft maneuvered and descended to the center of the courtyard in the middle of the building complex that Samuel was guarding. Now, this craft came down, reaching about 3 feet above the ground, at which point it stopped and stayed completely still. It was now about 35 feet away from him. He said that this craft had little round lights around the lower circumference of it. It was after about 1 minute, a small rounded hatch opened from the lower section of the craft, and a strange humanoid entity came out. He said it was over 6 feet tall, had kind of a light bulb shaped head, bald, large round eyes that reminded him in some ways of the iris of a camera. He said it also wore dark, shiny clothing. And this entity began to walk in an almost mechanical way away from the ship and directly towards Samuel. This scared Samuel quite badly. He wanted to reach out and find something to protect himself, but he was still unable to move a muscle. Then, to Samuel's relief, this entity stopped its approach, stood still, and began to move its head around in different directions as if surveying the area. And it did this for quite some time, about 15 minutes, at which point it retraced its steps back to the craft and re-entered through this hatch. This hatch closed, and it showed no seams at all on the surface of this craft. After the hatch closed, the lower part of the craft lit up with this series of bright blue lights. It then made a loud humming sound, he says kind of like a swarm of bees, but much higher pitched, and the craft now rose up slowly, vertically. The blue lights around the base became brighter and brighter, and once this craft reached the level of the roofs, it shot off at high speed and was instantly gone in a split second. Samuel's paralysis immediately broke. He quickly rushed inside, got a piece of paper to draw the entity in the craft that he had seen so he wouldn't forget it, and then reported it to his superiors, and of course, the whole experience soon reached investigators, and that's how we heard about it today. In many ways, that's a very typical case, and again showing this very common pattern of a UFO dropping down from the sky, landing right next to a witness, ETs coming out, and walking up to the witness and then returning back inside. So I don't know. Again, I'm wondering if these are simply displays, little introductions. Hard to say for sure, but it certainly is interesting. And now we move to another really fascinating case. This one is so bizarre and in some ways quite frightening for the witness. Understandably, I think. I call this one the humanoid in the bathroom. This one took place on June 24, 2001 in Peloponnese, Greece. It is a single witness case, but what's so fascinating about this case is how this ET was running around inside this person's house. And, well, let's just get into it and you'll see. This very bizarre and high strangeness case comes from Greek researcher Thanasis Vembos. He's written quite a few books on these kinds of subjects. Now, the sole witness is known only by his initials, Mr. G.P., but he's considered by Thanasis to be a very reliable witness and is in fact a professor at the University of Patras. This is in Peloponnese, Greece, where this encounter took place. It was at 1:50 a.m. on June 2001. Mr. G was watching television in the living room of his home. His wife and young child were asleep in their bedrooms. His other daughter was away from the house at this time. And Mr. G was getting ready to go to bed. He turned off the television. He saw that the light in the kitchen was still on, so he went to turn it off. Flicking it off and turning around, he suddenly felt this unusual, cool chill sweep over his body, almost like a cool wind. So turning back around, he got an incredible shock because he was standing face to face with a strange humanoid. It was tall, 6 feet, maybe 2 inches tall, and it was wearing a strange, tight-fitting blue coverall, covered his entire body. It had wave-like patterns on the surface. He said his body was thin and lanky, but it was his face that was most strange, or rather lack of it, because all Mr. G could see were vaguely human features, sort of small bumps where the eyes, nose, and mouth would be. So he couldn't see any face. It almost looked to Mr. G like a computer graphic, he said. And he was close. It stood only 6 feet away from him. And then things became even more strange when this being started to bound around like an athlete. Like an athlete leaps over hurdles, is how Mr. G described it, but moving in this weird, slow motion. It reminded him of, quote, a dancer with his toes not touching the ground. And Mr. G watched this figure flee from the kitchen and enter into the open bathroom just off of the kitchen. Mr. G chased it into the bathroom, but to his shock, the bathroom was empty. There was no escape, so where did the entity go? Of course, he began searching the house, and he was now shocked to see this entity coming out of his daughter's room, apparently having moved through the wall of the bathroom into there. It moved into the kitchen and back into the bathroom, where it again disappeared. Mr. G chased it again, but it wasn't there. Apparently this happened a third time. He watched it come out of the bathroom and now vanish into the living room. And after that, it was gone and did not return. Mr. G did have the strange impression that it was, quote, running away from something, or, quote, being hunted by something and wanting to avoid any contact. He said that although it was able to move through walls in an ethereal way, he felt absolutely certain that this creature was, quote, something solid. So this did not look like an apparition to him. He was understandably shocked by the experience. He doesn't remember it making any sound. He's not sure if this weird feeling of cold persisted through the encounter, because this whole incident, which lasted no more than 30 seconds, was so shocking that he stopped paying attention to the temperature. He says he did not smell anything unusual. He wonders, however, if this might have been connected in some way to 2 other unusual experiences earlier in his life, because once in 1974, somebody knocked at his door. He answered the door and there was a strange woman asking for money. And as she's talking, suddenly she vanished into thin air. So perhaps a spirit of some kind? And another time in 1986, he saw his mother-in-law on a bus, actually watched her for 5 minutes. The thing is, his mother-in-law had already passed away some time earlier. So perhaps he has mediumistic abilities, but he still insists that this figure with the blue jumpsuit was a solid figure. I mean, there's no denying that that is high strangeness for you. Can you imagine going into your kitchen and seeing this very tall humanoid without any apparent face, and dressed up in this tight blue jumpsuit? ETs do seem to love these jumpsuits. It's a very common alien fashion. I'm going to have to do an episode on alien fashions one of these days, just to take a look at how ETs dress. But yeah, that's very common. I also found it interesting that the witness had some really profound spiritual experiences as well with what are apparently ghosts, though he's convinced up and down that this was not a spiritual being, but a physical being. And you know, it sure sounds like it. There was no UFO directly involved, but it certainly matches what many other people describe with humanoids coming out of craft. And now we move to the final case in this compilation. This is a really interesting series of events which occurred to a single witness, though he did try to get other witnesses. I call this one, It Appeared 3 Times. This occurred in December 2001 in Tampa, Florida. It involves a young man who had 3 encounters in a row with a gray type ET, all of which began in kind of the same way. I wonder if there's more to this case than we're hearing about, if he's had further encounters since then. Fortunately, I don't have any way of following up with the witness on this case, but I think it's an important one, and that's why I wanted to share it with you today. This very bizarre case comes from researcher Albert Rosales, who did a first-hand interview with the witness. It was one evening in December 2001 that the witness was inside his home near Tampa, Florida, when he heard a strange sound coming from the backyard. He said it reminded him of somebody crinkling the package of a bag of chips. But as he was watching his favorite show, he ignored the sound. But then, a few minutes later, he heard it again, so he thought it might be one of his dogs. There was a commercial playing on the television, so he decided he'd walk into the bathroom, which was sandwiched between his and his brother's rooms, and had a window facing the entire backyard. And looking out through the bathroom window, he didn't see his dogs, but he saw something much stranger. A 3-foot-tall, human-looking figure with a weird lump on its head. And as soon as he saw it, this creature ran towards the fence and vanished. So he stood there in shock for just a few seconds, but immediately ran into his brother's room and told him what happened. His brother unfortunately did not believe him, so he went and told his mother, who was also skeptical. But the witness knew he had seen something, so he grabbed a flashlight and a knife from the kitchen, went out into the backyard, and this little man was gone, and there was no evidence that he had been there. But this was just the first incident, because it was just a few weeks later, around dusk, the witness had walked into the kitchen to get something to drink when he heard this same weird crinkling sound. So he ran to the window, and there it was, this same tiny figure. But this time he said, while it looked identical, it had a bluish tint to it. And he watched it for about 2 seconds when it promptly vanished into thin air. So he ran back to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, rushed out into the backyard, checked all over for any trace of it, but again there was nothing. Now his dogs were in the house at the time. They didn't react in any way, but he decided to let them out to search the yard, and they did not seem to notice anything unusual, did not react in any way. And it was just a few days later that the witness had his third and final encounter. He was riding his bike outside through the neighborhood. It was a chilly night, and he was returning home, and he was about 2 houses away from his own house when he saw this same figure again. Only this time it stood in the backyard of the house next to him, 2 houses down. Now this yard had no fence obscuring the backyard, so he could get a good look at it. And it was the same figure all right, only this time it sort of had a reddish glow to it. And it again had a couple of weird bumps on its head. So he rushed home, ditched his bike, returned to the neighbor's house to tell them what he had seen and warned them about this figure in the backyard. But once again, they did not believe him. Now, Albert Rosales, who interviewed the witness, wonders if perhaps these were three different figures. But again, hard to say, and certainly an unusual case. Another really interesting case. That last one, it's interesting to me because rarely is a face-to-face encounter with a humanoid a one-off. People who have this kind of encounter usually have other encounters, whether it's a simple sighting or not, but rarely is it a singular event. What's interesting in this case is that he never did see a UFO, and yet he saw this clearly gray type ET 3 times, very close up. So something's going on there. Really fascinating stuff. So that's it for today. 10 humanoid cases from all over the world, the United States, South America, Europe, Cuba. Just goes to show these things are happening all over our planet. It's been going on for a very long time. And as I've said before, it's much more common than people realize. Fascinated that the humanoid form seems to be the universal template. And as many contactees have been told, we apparently share a common heritage with these ETs. And as contactees have also been told, we are you, you are us, we are all one. And I think we see that in these cases. But with each case, we learn a little bit more about what's going on. So I hope you learned something. I hope you found these cases interesting. I really want to thank you guys for watching. It's because of you I do this research. Also for myself, frankly. I want to know what's going on, having had several of my own encounters. All right, thank you again, and until next week, keep searching the skies. Keep looking for the truth. Keep asking those hard questions. And most important of all, keep having fun, and I will see you all next week. Bye for now.